All right, so welcome everyone to another deep dive.
Yeah, excited for this one.
I am too. I think this one's going to be really, really fascinating. We've got some really rich source material this time around.
Absolutely.
We're going to be looking at Furqan Qureshi blogs um, and kind of unpacking everything we can learn from it about the world into which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born.
Yeah, like really trying to understand, 7th century Arabia.
Yeah, forget like the surface level stuff, like when we really want to go deep.
Deep dive.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, to really kind of set the stage here, uh, we need to remember, why is it so important to understand like the context that someone like the Prophet, peace be upon him, emerged from?
I think it's crucial, right? Because I think when we talk about these monumental figures in history, I think to really appreciate their impact, you need to understand the environment, the existing conditions that they came from.
Right. Like what were the norms? What were the accepted ways of doing things?
The challenges. And the landscape that this new message entered, what was that like?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's really all about kind of getting that richer, more nuanced understanding.
It's like the aha moments of history.
Yeah, exactly. And for me personally, like those are the moments that really make history come alive.
I agree.
Yeah. So okay, so let's jump into this. And I think the first big area that we need to unpack is this idea of the internal conditions of Arabia.
Yeah.
So what was Arabia like as a place?
So one of the first things that jumps out at me when I think about, 7th century Arabia is this idea of its isolation. Like it was geographically isolated, right? Largely a desert, rugged mountains, not really the type of place that was easy for, huge empires to just come and conquer.
No, not at all.
And this really had a profound impact on Arabian culture.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
The desert limited external influence, and it actually played a really important role in preserving like the purity of the Arabic language.
Oh, wow. So unlike other places that were constantly having migrations and conquests and all of that,
Yeah.
Arabia really kind of maintained its own distinct thing.
It kept its linguistic purity because of its unique circumstance.
Oh, wow. So they really took pride in the language?
They took huge pride in it, so much so that, they actually viewed non-Arabs as dumb.
Oh, wow.
The word they used was ajami,
Ajami.
which literally meant those who can't speak.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how deeply, language was woven into their identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because the source here points out that, 7th century Arabs had this incredible skill with poetry. Like they were really, really good at it.
Oh, yeah, they took great pride in it. Poetry wasn't just a pastime. It was a vital means for them to record their ancestry, celebrate their achievements, reinforce their identity, in a largely oral society.
Wow. And so were there like any particular examples that stand out like of this high level of like poetic artistry?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most famous examples are the Sabam Walakat, sometimes referred to as like the Hanging Seven. They were these 7 celebrated poems that were actually displayed in the Kaaba.
In the Kaaba, wow.
Yeah, so you can see how, they were putting their best poetry literally in the most sacred space.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And I think, what's even more mind-blowing to consider is that, eventually the Quran would arrive and it would also have this, unparalleled linguistic beauty.
Absolutely. And it kind of challenged this existing tradition of poetic excellence in a way.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, talk about a clash of the titans.
Exactly.
But okay, so it wasn't all, beautiful verses and linguistic pride.
Yeah.
The source also talks about this really deep-seated culture of tribal warfare that was happening at the time.
Oh, yeah, it was everywhere.
Like, how prevalent are we talking?
It's estimated that there were like 100 to 125 battles before the Prophet's time.
Wow, that's a huge number. And what were they fighting about? Like, what were the causes of these battles?
That's the interesting part. A lot of them seem to lack, a clear logical basis. They were fueled by like tribal egos and long-standing animosities.
So they were just kind of like passing down these grudges and these hatreds?
Exactly, like generation to generation.
Yeah.
And it created this constant backdrop of conflict.
Wow, it sounds so different from how we might understand conflict today.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't always about like resources or territory in the way that we might think about it today.
Right, right. And I guess, in an environment like that, it makes sense that there would be a real fascination with weapons.
Oh, yeah. Weapons were everything. Swords, arrows, shields. They all had names.
Hmm.
The Prophet's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, he had a famous sword named Akshan.
Akshan.
Yeah, and get this, they had over 1,000 words just for horses and swords.
1,000 words just for those two things.
Just for those two, so you can see where their priorities were.
Wow, that's really telling, and it also really goes to show you, like, how much the language was intertwined with this culture of warfare.
Oh, absolutely. The richness of the vocabulary associated with it speaks volumes.
Okay, so we've talked about poetry, we've talked about warfare.
Yeah.
The source also sheds some light on some practices that were maybe not as noble, shall we say.
Definitely.
And one of the things that comes up is this idea that, some tribes were notorious for being dishonest in their trading practices.
Yeah, there was a lot of that going around.
What kind of dishonesty are we talking?
Like cheating, stealing, even outright robbery.
Wow.
They were even known as like the Duban al-Arab.
Duban Arab?
Which means like the wolves of Arabia.
Wolves of Arabia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and their tactics were brutal. They would do things like hide wells to leave travelers stranded.
Oh, my gosh.
To die of thirst.
That's awful.
Yeah, it was a breakdown of ethical conduct for sure.
And how widespread was this? Like, were we talking about just a few bad apples? Or it seems like it was a real problem. Some scholars compare them to, like, the thuggies of India.
Thuggies?
Yeah, who were known for their ruthlessness.
Wow, so this was a serious issue.
Oh, yeah. It really underscores the challenges in establishing any kind of stable or just social order.
Yeah, and, as you can imagine, all of this instability and dishonesty had a huge impact on trade.
Absolutely, because of the constant warfare and these wolves of Arabia, trade was really restricted.
So it was almost impossible to conduct any kind of business.
Pretty much, it was mainly confined to the sacred months.
The sacred months.
When there was a truce,
right.
And they would have these fair-like gatherings, like in places like Ukaz.
Oh, wow. So it was almost like these little windows of opportunity for trade.
Exactly, these brief moments of peace and commerce.
And I guess it's easy to see how that would really hamper economic development.
For sure, it severely limited the interaction between communities.
Interesting. So it wasn't just like a moral issue, it was also a very practical one.
Absolutely.
Now, on a slightly lighter note, the source also touches on something that I found really interesting, which is this idea of love affairs.
Oh, yeah.
So apparently love affairs were actually seen as like a mark of strength and honor in Arab society.
That's right. And there was this one tribe in particular, the Bani Osra tribe, who were really renowned for their passionate and enduring love affairs.
Really?
Yeah, it was like their thing. Even just mentioning their tribal name, it was enough to conjure up images of these epic romances.
Wow. So they were like the ultimate romantics.
Something like that, yeah.
That's pretty fascinating. And I guess it kind of shows you that, despite all the warfare and the tribal rivalries, there was also this recognition of the importance of personal relationships.
Exactly. It gives you a glimpse into like the more emotional and personal side of their culture.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about isolation, language warfare, dishonesty, love affairs.
Yeah, it's been a journey.
It has been a journey, but I think now we need to turn our attention to perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the internal conditions of Arabia at that time.
I agree.
And that's the state of religion.
Right.
Because the source really paints a pretty stark picture of widespread religious deterioration.
It was pretty bad.
Yeah, like how bad are we talking?
Well, there were tribes that barely even knew about Allah.
Oh, wow.
And some who outright denied his existence.
Really?
And then alongside that, you had the widespread practice of idolatry and the worship of like celestial objects like the sun and the moon.
And it's wild to think that the Kaaba, which, for Muslims today is the most sacred site in Islam.
Yeah.
Back then, it was filled with idols.
I know. It's hard to imagine, right?
Yeah. And not just a few idols, like a lot of idols.
Yeah, like 360 of them.
360 idols in the Kaaba.
Inside the Kaaba.
Wow. So they had completely moved away from the monotheism of their ancestor, Prophet Abraham.
Yeah, it seems like over the centuries that the pure message had gotten corrupted.
And how did this happen? Like, how did things get so far off track?
Well, according to the sources, it seems like there was a pivotal moment that really triggered this whole shift towards idolatry. And it goes back about 400 years before the Prophet to a man named Ammar bin Luhi.
Ammar bin Luhi.
Yeah, so the story goes that he traveled to Syria, and he was really impressed by the idol worship that he saw there, which was likely influenced by Roman idolatry at the time.
Okay.
And so he brought back an idol with him named Hubal,
Hubal.
and he placed it right on the roof of the Kaaba.
Oh, wow. So he was the one who kind of kicked off this whole thing.
He seems to have played a major role.
And what happened after that? Like, did people just accept this right away?
Well, it seems like there was some resistance initially, but over time, the practice of idolatry became more and more widespread.
So it kind of like snowballed from there.
Exactly, and Amr bin Luhi didn't stop there. He went on to introduce other idols as well, like Asaf and Naila.
Asaf and Naila. Okay.
And he positioned them near the well of Zamzam.
Wow. So he was really intentional about promoting this new form of worship.
It seems like it.
And I guess, once that door was opened, it was hard to close it.
Yeah, it seems like that. And they even started holding these annual festivals dedicated to these idols.
Really?
Yeah, and if the Kaaba itself got too crowded, people would just create their own smaller idols called dawar idols.
So were idols?
Yeah.
So they could worship them wherever they were?
Exactly. So you can see how it really permeated their daily lives.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's crazy to think that by the 7th century, idolatry had become like the dominant religious practice.
It really had.
And what's even more fascinating is that a 9th century scholar in Baghdad named Hisham ibn Kalbi, he actually compiled an entire book about these idols.
Oh, wow, a whole book.
Yeah, it's called Kitab al-Islam.
Kitab al-Islam.
Yeah, and it goes into all the details about their forms and attributes.
So it was like an encyclopedia of idols.
Pretty much. And again, this book was actually lost for like 1,000 years.
Wow, 1,000 years.
Yeah, it was only rediscovered relatively recently.
So it's like a treasure trove of information about their beliefs.
Absolutely. And some of the descriptions of these idols are just wild.
Oh, yeah, like Naila and Suwa.
Naila and Suwa.
They were said to be enormous, stretching for like nearly a mile.
A mile-long idols.
Yeah, can you imagine?
That's insane.
It is. And then you had Yoguth, which was sculpted in the form of a lion, Yauk as a horse, Nasser as a vulture.
So they had all these different animal forms.
Yeah, and each one had its own specific attributes and powers.
And what about Hubal? Like the one that Amr bin Luhi brought from Syria?
Oh, yeah, Hubal was a big one. He was made of red agate, and he had a golden hand.
A golden hand.
Which actually got broken later on during the conquest of Mecca.
Oh, wow.
By Hazrat Ali.
Hazrat Ali, may Allah be pleased with him.
Yeah, so you can see how important Hubal was to them.
Absolutely. And there were so many other idols, too, like La'in and Taif and Al-Uzza, which was a major female deity.
Especially for the Quraysh.
Yeah, and what about this cube-shaped idol called Layth?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. People would circumambulate it, kind of like they did around the Kaaba.
So they were kind of mirroring that ritual.
Yeah, and then there was this other idol called Bil Khalasa that had this unique dance-like circumambulation associated with it.
Really?
And there was even a prophecy that women would be dancing around it right before the Day of Judgment.
Wow, that's very specific.
It is, right?
And they even had a temple in Nashran that was built entirely out of animal skins.
Yeah, that's another example of how diverse their practices were.
It's incredible. Like, when you think about idolatry, you might picture just like one or two main idols, but they had this whole pantheon of gods and goddesses.
Yeah, it was a complex religious landscape, for sure.
And what's even more surprising is that inside the Kaaba, alongside all these idols, they also had pictures of prophets that they revered.
Yeah, like Ibrahim, Ismail, Isa, and Maryam, peace be upon them all.
Wow. So it's like they still had some remnants of that monotheistic tradition.
Yeah, it seems like the memory of it hadn't been completely erased.
But at the same time, it had gotten all mixed up with all these other beliefs.
Yeah, it's like a blend of different traditions.
And the source also mentions this really wealthy individual named Seuss, who apparently had like 20,000 camels.
20,000 camels.
Yeah. And he was also a big promoter of idolatry.
So it wasn't just Amr bin Luhi who was influencing people?
No, it seems like there were a lot of different factors that contributed to the spread of idol worship.
Absolutely.
And on top of all that, they also engaged in the worship of celestial objects like the sun, the moon, and the stars.
And the moon was actually the most worshipped among these.
Oh, wow. Why the moon?
Well, it makes sense when you think about it. It was so visible and played such a crucial role in their lives for things like marking time seasons and navigation.
Right, especially in the desert.
Yeah.
So it was a very practical deity.
In a way.
And then, of course, you had all these priests and soothsayers who claimed to have knowledge of the unseen.
Oh, yeah, they were everywhere.
And they went by different names, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, all sorts of titles, and they followed different mythologies, and they used all kinds of methods for divination.
Like what kind of methods?
Everything from gazing into mirrors to examining the entrails of animals.
Well,
some even believed that they could communicate with jinn.
Wow. So there was this whole like supernatural element to their society.
Oh, yeah, people were really seeking guidance and meaning from any source they could find.
And that brings us to the world of superstitions, which the source says were just everywhere.
Oh, yeah, superstitions were a big part of their lives.
And is there any particular superstition that stands out to you as being like particularly interesting or strange?
Well, there's one that always sticks with me. It's a rattan branch test.
The rattan branch test.
Yeah, so it was used to assess a wife's fidelity when her husband came back from a journey.
Oh, wow.
So they would have this rattan branch, and if it bent, it meant that the wife was innocent.
Okay.
But if it stayed straight, well, that didn't bode well for her.
Oh my gosh. That's a pretty high stakes test.
Yeah, you can imagine the anxiety that must have caused.
Absolutely. And speaking of practices that are kind of hard to stomach, the way they treated animals
Yeah.
also sounds pretty grim.
It was pretty harsh by today's standards.
So what would they do?
Well, when someone died, they would tether their camel or horse to their grave and just leave it there to die
Oh my gosh.
of hunger and thirst.
Why would they do that?
Because they believed that it would be useful to them in the afterlife.
Wow. So their beliefs really dictated their actions, even if those actions seem, cruel to us today.
Yeah, it's a different worldview for sure.
And unfortunately, it doesn't end there, because there's another practice that we need to talk about that is just truly horrific, and that's female infanticide.
Right.
So the practice of burying newborn daughters, it was a reality in pre-Islamic Arabia.
A sad reality.
Yeah. And in some cases, they would actually let the daughters grow to the age of like 5 or 6.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then they would dress them up really beautifully, take them out to the desert, dig a pit, and bury them alive.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. And there's one account of a man from the Banu Tamim tribe named Qais ibn Assam, who is said to have buried 10 daughters in this way.
Wow.
It's just utterly chilling.
It's a devastating reminder of the low status of women in certain parts of their society.
And the Quran actually addresses this practice directly.
It does. There's a verse in Surah At-Takwir that talks about the buried girl being asked for her sin.
Oh, wow. And what does that verse tell us?
Well, it's a powerful condemnation of this practice. It highlights the injustice of it.
And why do you think they did this? Like, what were the reasons behind this horrific practice?
It's hard to say for sure, but many scholars link it to the prevalence of tribal warfare and this preference for male offspring who could grow up to be warriors.
So it was all about power and strength.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like it.
So, we've been talking about all these issues in pre-Islamic Arabia, idolatry, superstitions, violence against women, the treatment of animals.
That's a lot to take in.
It is. And it makes you wonder, were there any voices of reason? Were there any groups trying to counteract all of this?
Well, there were some Jewish and Christian tribes present in Arabia.
Okay, so they were there, but were they having any impact?
Unfortunately, it seems like their influence was quite limited.
Why is that?
Well, the source suggests that some of the Jewish rabbis were perceived as being quite arrogant
Oh, wow.
and prone to making extreme pronouncements.
So they weren't exactly winning hearts and minds.
No, not really. And then on the Christian side, monasticism had become quite corrupted in some areas.
Oh, wow.
So there were very few truly devout monks, and they were often isolated in their communities.
So they weren't really able to engage with society and make the difference.
It seems like it was a really difficult environment for them to operate in.
Wow. So it sounds like Arabia was really in a state of decline on pretty much every level.
In many ways, yes, but it's important to remember that even in the darkest of times, there are always glimmers of hope. And the source does mention some positive aspects of Arab society.
Okay, so it wasn't all bad.
No, not at all. In fact, the Arabs were known for their incredible kindness and generosity.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They took great pride in being generous. It was a core value for them. And they even have lots of poetry dedicated to it.
So generosity was like a big deal for them.
It was huge, and they would often go to great lengths to show hospitality to their guests.
Like what kind of lengths are we talking?
They would slaughter their most valuable animals even when resources were scarce.
Wow. So they were really putting their money where their mouth was.
Exactly. And there's this famous example of a man named Hatim Tai,
Hatim Tai. Okay.
who became legendary for his generosity.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He was known to do things like slaughter his prize horse for travelers, give away his entire herd of goats to a needy orphan boy, and even continue providing for his ex-wife long after they had separated.
Wow, that's next level generosity.
It really is, right? And whether or not all the stories about him are entirely true, he represents this ideal that they held so high.
That's amazing. And the source also highlights another positive trait, which is their strong commitment to keeping promises.
Yes, absolutely. A person's word was considered sacred.
So even in a society with all these problems, there was still a sense of honor and integrity.
Yes. And it was this honor that really helped to hold their society together.
That's really interesting. And it actually brings us perfectly to the second major area that we want to explore today, which is the Prophet's family.
Okay, let's dive in.
Yeah, so we begin with his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, who was the respected head of the family and the chief of the Quraysh tribe.
A prominent figure.
Absolutely. And his name itself is quite interesting because Abdul Muttalib means the servant of Muttalib, but that wasn't his original name.
Oh, right. His birth name was Sheba.
Yeah, and he actually spent his early years being raised in Medina, only later coming to Mecca.
So he had a bit of a unique upbringing.
He did, and there's this fascinating story about how even as a young boy, his noble lineage was recognized.
Oh, yeah, the story about the man from Tihama who saw him playing archery with the other kids.
Yeah.
And just by observing his demeanor and his confidence, he knew that this kid was someone special.
Wow, so they could really tell just by looking at him.
It seems like it. Yeah.
And so despite this kind of, unusual beginning, Abdul Muttalib eventually rose to become a very prominent leader in Mecca.
Oh, yeah. He held 5 unique positions of authority.
Wow. And he had a large family too, right?
He did 10 sons and 6 daughters.
Wow. And it was during his leadership that some really significant events took place. The first being the rediscovery of the well of Zamzam.
Oh, yeah. That's a pivotal story.
It is, and it's amazing to think that the location of this well had actually been lost for centuries.
I know. It's incredible, right?
I know.
And the way that it was rediscovered is equally remarkable.
So tell me about that. Like, how did Abdul Muttalib find it?
Well, he had a series of dreams.
Dreams, okay.
Yeah, and each dream gave him more specific instructions on where to dig.
So it was like a divine treasure hunt.
Exactly. First, he was told to dig for Tayaba, then Bara, then Madnuna, and finally Zamzam.
Wow. So he was getting more and more specific each time.
Yeah, and there were also these specific signs that he was told to look for.
Okay, like what kind of signs?
Well, in one dream, he saw dirt, in another blood, and in another, ant nests and a cawing crow, all appearing between the idols Asaf and Nayla.
Wow. So these were like very clear markers.
Yeah, they were unmistakable.
And so what happened when he started digging?
Well, the Quraysh actually tried to stop him.
Really?
They were worried about him digging so close to their idols.
Oh, so they saw it as a threat.
Yeah, they were afraid that he might damage them or uncover something that would undermine their beliefs.
So Abdul Muttalib didn't let that stop him.
No, he was determined.
And so he kept digging, and eventually
He found it.
he found the well.
He did, and he declared that it was the well of their ancestor Ishmael.
Oh, wow. So it was a really significant discovery, not just practically, but also symbolically.
Absolutely, it connected them back to their heritage.
And did the Quraysh just accept this?
Not at first. They argued that the well was a shared ancestral resource.
So they wanted a piece of the action.
Yeah, pretty much. But then something amazing happened.
What was that?
Water gushed forth from the well.
Wow. Just like that.
Yeah, and it happened right at the spot where Abdul Muttalib's camel had knelt during their journey to consult a priestess in Syria.
Wow. That's a pretty clear sign.
It was seen as a divine confirmation of Abdul Muttalib's claim.
And what about the Quraysh? Did they finally back down?
Yeah, they had to admit defeat after that.
Wow. That's an incredible story. And it gets even more incredible because this is where we get to the story of Abdul Muttalib's vow.
Right.
So remind me again, what was his vow?
Well, she had promised that if Allah made the difficult task of redigging Zamzam easy for him, he would sacrifice one of his sons.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty serious vow.
It was a huge sacrifice, and after the well was restored, Abdul Muttalib had a dream instructing him to fulfill it.
Oh, wow. So he couldn't just ignore it.
No, he felt a deep obligation to honor his promise.
And so what did he do?
He gathered his 10 sons, and he drew lots.
And the lot fell on
Abdullah,
Abdullah, his youngest and most beloved son.
the future father of the Prophet.
Wow. That's heartbreaking.
It was a devastating moment for Abdul Muttalib and his family.
And what about Abdullah himself? How did he react?
Well, there's this really moving account of his son Abbas clinging to him and begging him not to go.
Oh, gosh. That's so sad.
It really shows you the human cost of this commitment.
And so did Abdul Muttalib go through with it?
Well, the Quraysh intervened. They couldn't bear to see him lose his son.
Okay. And what did they suggest?
They proposed that they try to ransom Abdullah with something else.
Okay. And what did they offer?
They came up with the idea of sacrificing 100 camels instead.
100 camels. Wow.
Yeah, and they went to a soothsayer to see if that would be acceptable, and the
Yeah.
soothsayer agreed.
Wow. So so Abdullah was spared.
He was, and it's interesting because this event is actually referenced by the prophet himself later on when he says, I am the offspring of two sacrifices.
Oh, wow. Referring to both Ishmael and his own father, Abdullah.
Exactly. And there's also this tradition that mentions a radiance appearing on Abdullah's face after this whole ordeal.
Oh, wow. So it's like he was marked by this event.
Yeah, in a way, it set him apart.
That's amazing. And there's also the story of Qatal, the sister of Waraka ibn Nawfal, who saw Abdullah and immediately noticed a light on his face.
Right. She was so struck by it that she actually offered 100 camels to marry him right there on the spot.
Wow. So she was really taken with him.
Oh, yeah, but Abdullah respectfully declined because he couldn't go against his father's wishes.
Right, of course. And what happened after Abdullah married Amina?
Well, interestingly, Qatal completely lost interest in him.
Oh, wow. Why was that?
She said that she had only wanted to marry him because of the light that she had seen.
So it's like she was drawn to this spiritual aura.
Yeah, and she believed that the light had now been transferred to Amina.
Wow. So she was no longer interested in Abdullah himself, but in the destiny that he represented.
It seems like it, yeah, and she even composed a poem about it, expressing her feelings of both recognition and maybe even regret.
Wow, that's a really poignant story. And it speaks to this idea that there were people who could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen.
Yeah, they were looking for signs.
And speaking of signs,
Mm.
there's also this really intriguing account of Abdul Muttalib meeting a Jewish man in Yemen who was skilled in face reading and palmistry.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating story.
It is. So what happened in this meeting?
Well, this Jewish scholar looked at Abdul Muttalib's hands, and he immediately recognized signs of both leadership and prophethood.
Oh, so he could see it right there in his hands.
Yeah, but he also noted that these signs weren't actually meant for Abdul Muttalib himself.
Oh, wow. So who were they meant for?
He said they were destined for the lineage of Banu Zara.
Banu Zara.
Yeah, and he advised Abdul Muttalib to seek marriage alliances within that tribe.
Wow. So he was basically saying, you need to marry into this specific tribe if you want to see these signs fulfilled.
Yeah, it's like he was giving him a roadmap for the future.
That's incredible. And what did Abdul Muttalib do?
Well, he took the advice to heart.
He did.
He first married Hala from Banu Zara, who became the mother of Hamza.
Hamza.
Yeah, and then he arranged for his son, Abdullah, to marry Amina bint Wahab, who was also from Banu Zara.
And of course, Amina became the mother of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Exactly. And it's amazing to think that Hamza, the Prophet's uncle, was only 2 years older than him.
Really?
Yeah, and they were also milk brothers, which means they were both nursed by the same woman, Sobia.
Wow. So they were really close.
They were, and it just shows you how interconnected their family was.
Absolutely. And so we come to the final piece of the puzzle, which is Qatal's prophecy to her brother, Waraka ibn Nawfal.
Right.
So remind me again, what was her prophecy?
She predicted that the Banu Hashim clan would soon change the world.
Wow. And what did Waraka say to that?
He agreed with her. He believed it too.
Wow. So it's like everyone could sense that something big was about to happen?
Yeah, it was like this anticipation was building.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of pre-Islamic Arabia.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've covered so much ground.
Yeah.
We've seen the darkness and the light, the beauty and the brutality.
And I think it's really helped us to understand the context in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born.
Absolutely. And I think it also makes you appreciate just how much he changed the world.
Yeah, he came at a time when Arabia was really in desperate need of change.
And he brought a message of hope and unity.
A message that would transform not just Arabia, but the entire world.
And so here's a final thought for you to consider. How does learning about all of this, the complexities of pre-Islamic Arabia, deepen your understanding of the Prophet's mission and the impact of his message?
It's something for all of us to reflect on.
Yeah. It is. And we'll leave you with that thought until next time.
Peace be upon you.